1942. January.
Hitler orders the bombing of Malta, and Third Reich forces manage to put out of action the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, moored in the port of Alexandria. These events enable the Germans to reduce the presence of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean for a time, which facilitates the supply of their troops in North Africa. Both sides know that keeping the initiative is the key to winning the battle. The Fuhrer wants to take Tobruk in order to then carry out a definitive attack on Malta, and tells Rommel not to delay his counter-offensive. The Africa Corps commander plans to deceive the British into believing he is in full retreat by destroying ships that are not seaworthy and setting fire to deposits and stores that supposedly contain supplies. General Auchinleck is convinced of the weakness of the enemy and orders him to be pursued and eliminated. Rommel tells his staff, "The deception has worked," and prepares his men for battle. In the afternoon of the 21st of January, provided with 100 new tanks, he launches an offensive in the direction of Gazala and Bir Hakeim, alternating attack and defense. The Allies are overcome on all fronts. In Msus, the Africa Corps capture 1,000 soldiers and 100 tanks, 30 planes, and different enemy artillery pieces. The Axis armies, determined not to slow down their march, take Benghazi and capture part of the British supply depots. Auchinleck asks Churchill for greater reinforcements to halt and counterattack Rommel's troops. At the same time, he draws a defensive line 75 kilometers long from Ain el-Ghazala to Bir Hakeim. Along this line are placed a new system of defenses called boxes, isolated points heavily fortified, which are intended to block the path of the Axis forces to Tobruk. Rommel is concerned about the interruptions to his supply lines. The Royal Navy has re-established its dominance in the Mediterranean and continues attacking the convoys, transporting fuel and armaments to the German and Italian armies. With a view to overcoming this, the Africa Corps chief leaves the front to meet with Hitler and Mussolini, from whom he demands greater help. The lack of response from both leaders disappoints him. His journey has only served for him to be subjected to the insistent reproaches of the Fuhrer, who demands the immediate capture of Tobruk and the elimination of British resistance. Malta has suffered more than 1,000 Axis bombing raids. Every 18 hours for a month, the enemy planes have attacked. Only 25 kilometers long, the island has become the most heavily bombed target in the world. On the 15th of April, the people of the undefeated island are decorated for their bravery when King George VI awards the George Cross. Only 8 planes remain to fight against 15 Axis squadrons. The officers in charge of the defense of the island ask the king for Spitfires, and more Spitfires. But no British aircraft carrier is available for the dangerous and urgent mission to Malta. Churchill requests help from Roosevelt, and the response is swift. The U.S. aircraft carrier Wasp will transport the British Spitfires to the island. On the 29th, the desperately needed planes arrive in Malta. The Luftwaffe planes in Sicily are alerted and attack, destroying them before the British pilots have had time to take off. The 30th of April. The small island has been continuously besieged by air for 2 years. It is without planes for its defense, and its big guns are short on munitions. Nevertheless, the island's excellent shelters have kept the number of casualties incredibly low. The British fear an invasion from the air is imminent, believing Hitler and Mussolini have set the date for the attack for the start of June. The USS Wasp goes into action for a second time and is able to deliver a new batch of Spitfires, which quickly take off and surprise the enemy bombers. The German planes suffer the most in the confrontations, 37 being shot down against only 3 British planes. On the next day, the RAF pilots achieve even greater successes. The British planes are faster, more maneuverable, and have more firepower than those of the enemy. In intense air fights, they have brought down more than 60 Axis planes. Rommel uses the provisions he has sparingly and anticipates the British by taking the initiative on the 26th of May. The Italian artillery opens fire on the Gazala line, while the Stutkas bomb the boxes. Next day, the attempt of the armored divisions to envelop Auchinleck's forces fails. The presence of American Grant tanks forces a retreat at the beginning of the afternoon to the south and west, although in the north, they maintain their positions. On the 1st of June, the Allies deploy all their available forces in a pincer movement aimed at trapping the Axis troops between the 8th Army, the 150th Brigade, and the Gazala line. But once again, Rommel shows his military genius and orders a frontal attack on the 8th Army. In the action, he and his men, disguised in British uniforms, wave white handkerchiefs, causing complete confusion and achieving to the surrender of thousands of British troops. On the 8th of June, Rommel's panzers and troops, supported by the Luftwaffe planes, attack General Corning's position on the Gazala line. Without provisions or ammunition, the Allied troops abandon some of their defensive positions under cover of the night, leaving the road to Bir Hakeim open for Rommel. The British retreat in the north and the south to the Tobruk El Adem line, where Auchinleck has ordered their regrouping. Rommel is master of the situation. On the 19th of June, his soldiers advancing eastwards occupy Bardia, which has been abandoned by the British. Meanwhile, the 21st Panzer Division joins the bulk of the army south of Tobruk. The main attack on the city begins on the 20th. The Luftwaffe opens wide corridors through the minefields which surround it, and the armored vehicles, together with the Italian and German forces, advance from all directions. On the 21st of June, the Allied garrison in Tobruk surrenders. "35,000 soldiers are captured, along with important fuel and food deposits, and thousands of vehicles of all kinds." For Churchill, it is a heavy blow, though partly lessened by Roosevelt's offer of greater American involvement in the defense of North Africa. Hitler, satisfied by the victory, makes Rommel a field marshal.
Wieder zurückwerfen zu lassen. Man kann sich auch verlassen. Was wir haben, halten wir fest.
The new field marshal has achieved part of his plan. On the 26th of June, he meets with Generals Kesselring, Bastico, and Rintelen to devise the next phase of his offensive against Egypt. The plan is to take control of Alexandria, the principal port of the Mediterranean, and from there put an end to the British presence in Malta. This means the Fuhrer is forced to postpone the aerial invasion of the island. On the 28th of June, the Axis forces cut the road between Marsa Matruh and Alexandria, penning in the Allied troops with their backs to the sea. Auchinleck orders his men to break out of the encirclement and withdraw to establish the defensive line of El Alamein. The imprudent and aggressive field marshal and his victorious army, formed by 4 German and 8 Italian divisions, with a total of 96,000 soldiers, is able to take a further 8,000 Allied prisoners, and Rommel is convinced that the enemy cannot halt his advance. But Auchinleck's men managed to contain the attack on the eastern and southern flank. The German field marshal is worried about his supply lines being cut and decides to give his men a rest, leaving the action deadlocked. Meanwhile, he analyzes the Allies' movements in order to proceed to a new battle. The cities of Alexandria and Cairo prepare to confront Rommel's Africa Corps. The German field marshal has become legendary. The Desert Fox is worshipped by his men and respected by his enemies. Even Churchill is forced to recognize he is a great strategist. As a precautionary measure, the ships of the British fleet anchored in Alexandria are transferred to the Red Sea. El Alamein is only 100 kilometers to the west of the city. Its great advantage is that it's surrounded by the sea and the Katara Mountains, which makes access to it very difficult. The Allies have turned it into a veritable fortress. Rommel estimates that if new enemy reinforcements continue to arrive, by mid-September they will have more men than he can count on, and so he must undertake a new offensive before it's too late. Beginning on the 30th of June, the fighting continues during July, with advances and backward movement on both sides. In the face of the difficulties in North Africa, Hitler orders the troops earmarked for the invasion of Malta to be sent to the region. The invasion of the island is temporarily suspended, and the air attacks cease. But Malta's survival still depends on the outside world. Supplies arrive by sea. The Axis forces know this and begin to blockade the island to try to starve out its inhabitants. The British convoys that try to reach Malta suffer continual submarine and air attacks. Rationing is imposed, and the morale of the population falls. The British commanders set a date for surrender and send a message to Churchill informing him that if they are unable to meet basic necessities, the worst will happen. By the end of July, there is no more fuel, and Malta's destiny depends on a ship reaching its port. Churchill appeals to its people to hold on, and they will win through. On the 4th of August, Churchill arrives in Egypt to see the Allied situation for himself. He decides to remove Auchinleck and replaces him with Harold Alexander. Alexander advises him to put General William Gott at the head of the 8th Army. Gott is killed on the 7th of August in a plane accident when he is on his way to North Africa to take up the post. After consultation, the British Prime Minister names Bernard Montgomery as his substitute. Upon taking up the post, Monty, as he was familiarly known to colleagues, perceives that his men suffer what he calls the Rommel complex. The Allied troops are so obsessed with this desert lizard that all the enemy's successes are put down to Rommel. He therefore decides that Rommel's legend must be destroyed and his own built up. During the remainder of August, Montgomery completely reorganizes the 8th Army and tells his men, "Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." From Britain and the United States, convoy after convoy arrives in the ports of North Africa, bringing provisions. Meanwhile, Montgomery's men have turned El Alamein into an impregnable fortress, surrounded by minefields, barbed wire, and artillery. In a short time, the ratio of soldiers is 3-1 in the Allies' favor. Churchill is impatient for the offensive to begin, but the cautious Montgomery, conscious that the battle could be decisive for the course of the war, calms the Prime Minister, telling him that his attack will not be another failure, and that if they wait until October, he can guarantee a total success. The RAF's dominance in the air is unassailable, and the British general knows that. Given the situation of the Third Reich's forces in Europe, Rommel is fighting against the clock. The German field marshal's biggest problem is the arrival of supplies and reinforcements. Everything that is sent must make the dangerous crossing of the Mediterranean and then the 600-kilometer journey across the Libyan desert to reach the front. The Royal Navy and Allied planes ensure that the quantity is never sufficient. Despite illness, the energetic German carefully plans his counteroffensive, in which the element of surprise will be all important. His strategy consists of a rapid diversionary movement in the north, skirting the coast and attacking in strength 65 kilometers to the south. This is to be followed up by surrounding the 8th Army and hitting their rear. Once this action is successfully completed, the Axis forces will cross the desert in the direction of Cairo and the Suez Canal, the main artery of the British Empire in the Middle East. Operation Pedestal, the last hope of help for Malta, leaves Britain. "14 merchant and oil ships loaded with thousands of tons of supplies are escorted by 4 aircraft carriers, 40 destroyers, 2 battleships, and 12 cruisers. There are far too many ships to slip by the Germans unnoticed." On the 10th of August, the largest fleet that has ever sailed for Malta enters the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. 21 enemy submarines are waiting for it, and 700 planes are stationed in Sardinia and Sicily, ready to attack. On the 11th of August, U-73 sinks the aircraft carrier Eagle, while the Junkers 88 and Heinkel 111 attack the rest of the convoy. In the early hours of the afternoon of the 12th, 5 waves of Axis planes continued to attack the Allied ships. By the next day, most of the ships have been sunk. On the 14th of August, only 5 surviving ships managed to reach the port of La Valletta in Malta. The oil tanker Ohio, with its stern destroyed, comes into port towed by the Santa Elisa at 9:30 on the 15th. Rommel can count on the German High Command's promise that his fuel needs will be met before and during the battle. and he is convinced he will soon be placed among the heroes of the Reich. For their part, the British, using the same tactics as their opponents, have prepared a deception, placing the body of a dead Allied soldier on a reconnaissance vehicle with a map in his pocket, falsely identifying the positions of their minefields. The Afrika Korps find the map and deliver it to Rommel, who makes the mistake of believing its veracity. At midnight on the 30th of August, he orders the panzers to avoid the places indicated on the map and begin their attack. The Battle of Alam Halfa has begun. The trick has worked. The German tanks are trapped in the minefields, and the element of surprise that Rommel intended has been lost. On the 31st of August, Churchill sends Roosevelt and Stalin a message saying that, as expected, Rommel has begun the attack and has been well received. The British, aware of the enemy's plans, frustrate the German Field Marshal's offensive. At the same time, Royal Navy ships sink 3 German ships carrying fuel supplies crucial for the battle. Two days after beginning the offensive, in the face of strong Allied resistance and a lack of supplies, the German Field Marshal's troops are forced to fall back to their initial positions. Rommel has lost more than a battle. He has lost the initiative. The British Eighth Army begins to prepare its own strategy. Operation Lightfoot, led by Montgomery, is based on a clash of British and German armored vehicles. The date set for its start is the end of October, to coincide with the disembarkation of Allied troops in North Africa for Operation Torch, planned for the start of November. Monty begins the preparations with a series of skirmishes on different days to deceive Rommel as to the position of his regiments. These actions, codenamed Operation Bertram, also include the construction of a dummy pipeline, dummy tanks using jeeps, and dummy artillery positions in the southern zone. In the north, the real tank units are camouflaged to look like supply lorries. The Allied plans bear fruit, and the German intelligence services inform Rommel that the enemy works and movement will not be finished until November. Meanwhile, the Axis forces, waiting for the promised supplies, entrench in 2 defensive lines surrounded by barbed wire and 500,000 mines. The minefield is known as the Devil's Garden. Following the defeat at Alam Halfa, the German Field Marshal is aware that time is against him. The British have received thousands of reinforcements with the arrival of Indian and Australian troops and American tanks. Convinced that Montgomery's offensive will begin very soon in November, Rommel travels to Germany for urgent medical treatment and to push the High Command to speed up the dispatch of new soldiers, armaments, and fuel. but he is frustrated to see that priority is given to the Eastern Front. The OKW commanders are hoping the troops fighting in Stalingrad will soon take the city and can then be transferred through the Caucasus to Persia, Iran, and in this way, force the Allies in Africa to fight on two fronts, on the frontier of Egypt and Libya, and in Persia. Montgomery has finalized his tactical plan, which involves destroying Rommel's forces in their defensive positions. The method is not wholly orthodox. The infantry will move first, followed by the tanks. In mid-October, he reminds his troops that when he took charge of the 8th Army, he said their mission was to destroy Rommel and his army. Now, they are ready to do so, he tells them. On the night of the 23rd of October at 9:40 p.m., Operation Lightfoot begins. A 1,000 big guns fire on the surprised Germans for 6 hours. The bombardment destroys their communications network and explodes the minefields. The Allies breach the Axis forces' first defensive line along an 8-mile front where the infantry penetrate. With the intensity of the fighting, Rommel's temporary substitute, George Stumm, dies of a heart attack, and General Wilhelm Ritter takes his place. The German field marshal, informed of the surprise British attack, leaves his hospital bed in Berlin and undertakes the return journey to Egypt. Meanwhile, to the south of Alamein, the British make a diversionary move to attract the attention of the 21st Panzer Division and the Italian Ariete Armored Division. By the end of the 25th, the Allies have opened a 10-mile wide breach in the German front, and all their armored vehicles begin to cross it. In the early hours of the 26th, the Axis tank divisions, with Rommel back in charge, try unsuccessfully to halt the Allied attack. The German field marshal writes to his wife, "Rivers of blood were poured out over miserable strips of land." The situation of the Axis worsens when the oil tanker Proserpina is sunk outside Tobruk by an RAF Bristol bomber. The Africa Corps only has fuel for 3 days. Rommel sends an urgent message to Hitler, If we don't do something immediately to remedy the supply problem, the battle is lost. Believing it is now or never, he groups all his motorized units and decides on a new attempt to surprise the enemy. He transfers part of his force to the north, on the Mediterranean coast, and leaves the Italians to hold the positions along the southern front. But the superiority of the Allies prevents him from carrying out the enveloping maneuver, and the Axis forces have to fight desperately to contain the attack by British armored vehicles. Despite the shortage of transport, Rommel arranges for the withdrawal of his army to Fuka in an attempt to save a part of his offensive capacity. Meanwhile, Monty is gathering together an assault force to intervene in Operation Supercharge, the final part of the battle. This begins on the 2nd of November with the objective of making the definitive breach in enemy lines and destroying the few operational armored vehicles remaining. The RAF bombed the Axis positions in Tel al-Akakir and Sidi Abd al-Rahman, which is coupled with an intense artillery bombardment. In the early hours of the afternoon, the German Panzers and the Allies' Sherman M4s, among others, clash in the Battle of Akakir Ridge. The Sherman M4s are far superior. By nightfall, Rommel has only 35 operational tanks left. He has no provisions, and his men are exhausted and unable to resist another Allied attack. The German Field Marshal sends a message to Hitler's headquarters asking to be allowed to retreat immediately. Hitler replies, "We cannot show to your troops any other path except those which leads to victory or death." With or without Hitler's permission, Rommel maintains the order to retreat. The Desert Fox is on the run. On the 4th of November, the British finish off the Italian Ariete, Littorio, and Trieste tank divisions. The Battle of El Alamein is over. The Axis forces retreat along the Mediterranean coast, from Alexandria to Tunis. A euphoric Churchill visits Montgomery and congratulates his men, convinced that the Third Reich is beginning to crack. The Africa Corps has lost 12,000 men and 350 tanks, and the Allies 23,000 men and 120 tanks. Although it did not have great strategic value, both Churchill and Roosevelt, against Stalin's wishes, had decided to open a second front in Africa as a rehearsal for the Normandy invasion. Besides, with this initiative, they were trying to ensure that the Vichy's government's colonial troops joined the Allies. With the codename Operation Torch, and commanded by an unknown general without combat experience called Dwight Eisenhower, a headquarters was set up on Gibraltar on the 5th of November for future operations. The campaign is considered one of the most important of the war. The mission is to begin a worldwide offensive against the Italian and German armies. The plans contemplate 3 shock forces. The Western Task Force, under George Patton, is to take Morocco and Port Liaté, Casablanca, and Safi. The Central Task Force, commanded by Commodore Thomas Trowbridge, is to disembark in Oran. The Eastern Task Force, under Vice Admiral Burrow, is to occupy Algiers. Thousands of tanks, planes, arms, and vehicles of all kinds are to be taken in the ships that make up this enormous naval operation. Under the command of Admiral Cunningham, 300 ships sail slowly to North Africa, dodging the enemy submarines by day and advancing in a straight line by night. It is the longest journey ever made to carry out an amphibious maneuver. On the 8th of November, the invasion force under Eisenhower is ready to disembark on the coasts of Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The British Secret Services have won over to the cause the commander of the French forces in Algiers, General Juin, and expect the city will be handed over quickly. But on the same day as the disembarkation, Admiral Darlan, the head of the Vichy French forces in North Africa, arrives. Unexpectedly, the Allies are met with fire from the coast. After a day of heavy fighting and the loss of 2 British destroyers, Burrow's troops managed to take the city and force Jean Darlan, one of Churchill's greatest enemies, to order his men to cease fire. Hitler believes he has been betrayed and orders his armies to occupy the whole of Vichy French territory. On the 24th of December, Darlan is assassinated. In Oran, the resistance is stronger. The French Marines fight furiously against the 1st U.S. Armored Division, but with the arrival of British reinforcements, they are taken prisoners. In Casablanca, the situation is complicated by the fact that the commander in charge, General Bouthouart, whom the British had also won over to the cause, is arrested and imprisoned by General Nogue, loyal to Petain's government. Nogue attacks Eisenhower's troops with all his available regiments. Planes from the aircraft carrier USS Ranger are forced to engage in heavy fighting with the French planes, while the Allied cruisers and destroyers opened fire on the city's port, sinking the ships there. The last stand by the Vichy troops, led by Rear Admiral Gervais de la Font, ends in failure in the face of the Allied landings. After 3 days of heavy fighting, the city surrenders on the 11th of November. (1943). At the Casablanca Conference on 14th of January, Churchill and Roosevelt tried to resolve their differences over how to defeat the Third Reich. The British leader favors continuing the struggle in the Mediterranean before beginning an attack in northern Europe. His plan is to invade Sicily and then the Italian peninsula. The idea is to topple Mussolini and force Hitler to transfer troops from France and Central Europe to counter the occupation. Once Italy is conquered, his plan is to establish air bases from where they can carry out continual heavy bombing raids on Germany's armaments factories and the oil fields of Romania. Roosevelt, on the other hand, agrees with Stalin that the invasion of northern France is the shortest way to finish off the Nazi regime, though he admits that its preparation will take time. He is unwilling to offer Italy anything but unconditional surrender. Finally, the American president reluctantly accepts Churchill's plans. Rommel and his army, broken up into different combat groups, wait in Tunis for the arrival of reinforcements. Entrenched in the capital and the city of Bizerta, they protect the nearby airfields and await the next Allied assault. Forced to fight on two fronts, the German Field Marshal gains his last victory in the desert on the 16th of February. The Axis forces stage an ambush in the Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains against the inexperienced American troops of General Frendendahl, inflicting a heavy defeat. On the 23rd of February, Rommel hands over command to General von Arnim. The Allies have concentrated more than 500,000 men in Tunis and take the defensive lines at Maret and Akarit. On the 8th of March, the chief of the Afrika Korps leaves North Africa, tasting the bitterness of defeat. His departure is kept secret to avoid demoralizing the Axis troops, who take refuge in the Cape Bone Peninsula. On the 7th of May, the Allies enter Bizerta and Tunis. On the following day, General von Arnim surrenders. On the 12th of May, Mussolini orders General Mies to hand over his weapons to the British. 250,000 soldiers are taken prisoner, 130 Germans and 120 Italians. On the 20th of May, the Allies celebrate the victory with a massive parade in Tunis. The war enters a new phase, which Churchill describes in these words. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.